The sea was calm that night, a black mirror reflecting a sky heavy with clouds that threatened a storm. A group of sailors aboard the Valkyrie, a cargo ship en route to the northern ports, joked and smoked on the deck, unaware of the creeping terror that would soon engulf them. It began with the fog thick, unnatural, and swirling in slow, ghostly tendrils. It rolled in faster than any of them had ever seen, blanketing the ocean and swallowing the stars. The chatter died down as the crew stared into the mist, which seemed to shimmer with an eerie, pale glow. Suddenly, through the dense fog, a shadow emerged. It was the silhouette of a ship, enormous and old, its hull blackened and splintered, yet it moved with an eerie grace. The Valkyrie's captain barked orders to steer clear of the vessel, but no matter which direction they turned, the ghost ship remained on a direct course toward them. As it grew nearer, the crew could make out more details. The sails were tattered, flapping lifelessly despite the lack of wind, and the ship's deck appeared abandoned. Its timbers groaned, and the faint sound of creaking would echo through the fog like the moaning of lost souls. A rotten stench, like decaying flesh, filled the air, causing the men to cover their noses in disgust. The captain, growing desperate, ordered the crew to signal the mysterious ship, but no response came. Then, without warning, the ship halted, its bow just a few feet from the Valkyrie. There was something unnatural about the way it loomed there, as if it were waiting. One of the younger crew members, a boy named Liam, grabbed a rope and attempted to board the ship out of sheer curiosity, ignoring the captain's warning shouts. As soon as his feet touched the ghostly deck, a change swept over the air, sudden, suffocating cold, as if the warmth of life itself had been snuffed out. The boy stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror. The crew could only watch in horror as skeletal hands, pale and decayed, reached up from the ship's shadows, wrapping around Liam's legs. His screams echoed in the night, but no one dared move to save him. The hands dragged him into the darkness, and his cries faded into silence. Blood oozed from the seams between the ship's planks, thick and black like oil, dripping down into the sea below. It stained the water, a spreading pool of death that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The rest of the crew, paralyzed with fear, watched helplessly as the ghost ship's deck began to shift. Figures, grotesque and deformed, slithered out from beneath the floorboards, twisted sailors with hollow, eyeless faces, their mouths gaping wide as if in endless screams. Their bodies were bloated, waterlogged, and covered in barnacles, and they moved with an unsettling, jerky motion, as though they were puppets controlled by unseen strings. Then the ship's bell tolled a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the Valkyrie. One by one, the crew members felt a cold grip on their hearts, their breath catching in their throats as they realized the truth. This was no mere ship. It was a vessel of the damned, a ferryman for lost souls. The captain, eyes wide with terror, whispered, "We've been marked." He turned to his men, but before he could issue another command, the ghostly crew surged forward, climbing onto the Valkyrie with unnerving speed. Each of them was grabbed by the damned sailors, their flesh rotting at the touch, skin peeling away in chunks as they screamed in agony. Blood sprayed across the deck, mixing with the black waters below, the stench of death overwhelming. The ghostly sailors dragged the living crew across the Valkyrie's deck, their skeletal hands ripping into flesh with unnatural strength. Bones snapped like brittle twigs, and screams filled the air, blending into a horrifying symphony of pain. The fog thickened, swirling around the chaos as if it were alive, drinking in the terror of the dying men. The captain, his breath ragged with fear, tried to draw his sword, but his hands trembled too violently. A shadowy figure loomed behind him, larger than the others. Its body was a grotesque mass of decayed muscle, covered in barnacles and seaweed, with long, dripping strands of hair that clung to its hollow skull. It raised a rusted, jagged blade high into the air, and before the captain could react, the sword plunged into his back with a sickening squelch. Blood poured from the wound, staining his uniform as he crumpled to the deck. As the captain lay dying, his eyes dimming, He glimpsed the ghost ship's figurehead, an intricately carved woman, her face twisted in eternal agony, her eyes weeping blood. And then, just as his vision blurred, the ship spoke not with words, but with a terrible, soul-crushing whisper that echoed deep within his mind. All who sail the sea of the dead belong to me. The few remaining crew members, who hadn't yet been torn apart or dragged below deck, found themselves cornered. They huddled together, their faces pale, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. One of them, an older man named Jacobs, muttered prayers under his breath, his lips quivering. But in this place, prayers meant nothing. The ghost ship began to creak and groan once more, the sounds almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat from something far older and darker than the sea itself. The surrounding waves churned, black water bubbling as though something massive stirred beneath the surface. One of the sailors dared to peer over the edge of the Valkyrie, only to stagger back in horror. Below them, barely visible in the depths, was a writhing mass of bodies, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of drowned souls. Their faces were contorted in torment, eyes wide with desperation, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. Their hands reached upward, clawing toward the surface, toward the living, as though they could drag them down into the watery abyss. The deck beneath the sailors' feet began to soften, the wood rotting away rapidly, turning to mush beneath their boots. One of the men cried out as his foot sank into the black sludge, and within seconds, the floor gave way, swallowing him whole. The others watched, helpless, as his screams were abruptly cut off, his body vanishing into the dark, shifting mass that had once been solid planks of wood. Jacobs, his face slick with sweat, took a step backward, his eyes wild with terror. "This is it," he muttered. "We're all dead. We've been dead since the moment that ship appeared." Before anyone could respond, the ship's bell tolled again, louder this time, a deep, booming sound that shook the air and rattled their bones. The fog pulsed, thickening even further, until they could barely see each other through the gloom. And then the voices began. Whispers slithered out of the fog, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. They were voices of the dead, sailors lost at sea, mothers who had drowned in shipwrecks, and children whose cries for help had been swallowed by the waves. Their words were jumbled, incoherent, but one phrase repeated over and over, echoing in the minds of the remaining crew. "Join us, join us, join us." Jacobs clutched his head, screaming, trying to drown out the voices, but it was useless. His eyes rolled back into his skull as he collapsed to his knees, blood trickling from his ears. The others fell to the deck as well, writhing in pain as the voices clawed at their minds, pulling them closer to madness. And then, just when it seemed like they could endure no more, the fog parted. Standing at the center of the ghost ship's deck was a figure cloaked in shadow, its form flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but from beneath the folds of its tattered cloak, long, skeletal fingers extended, beckoning the sailors forward. With a terrible sense of finality, they realized this was their end. There would be no escape, no salvation. The sea had claimed them, and now they belonged to the ghost ship forever. The shadowy figure stepped forward, gliding effortlessly across the deck. Its presence was suffocating, an unbearable weight pressing down on the living, crushing their spirits. One by one, the sailors stopped struggling, their eyes glazing over as they stood, drawn toward the figure like moths to a flame. As they reached the edge of the ship, the fog swirled around them, wrapping them in cold, ghostly tendrils. With one final, desperate scream, they fell forward, disappearing into the black waters below. The sea was silent once more. The sea swallowed the last of the sailors with a chilling silence. The dark waters rippled, then smoothed over, as if they had never been disturbed. The ghost ship, looming like a grim sentinel, remained anchored in place, a monument to the cursed souls it had claimed. For a long moment, nothing moved. The wind, which had been still for hours, began to stir, sending shivers through the tattered sails of the Valkyrie. The ghost ship groaned, its ancient timbers creaking under the weight of untold centuries of suffering. And then, as if in response to some unseen command, it began to drift away, fading back into the mist from which it had come. But the curse lingered. As the fog thinned, revealing a sky now heavy with stars, the Valkyrie remained adrift, alone on the vast, black ocean. The deck was empty, save for the remnants of blood and tattered clothing, the only traces left of the doomed crew. Yet, the ship itself was not lifeless. Deep below, in the hull, something stirred. A faint, rhythmic thumping echoed through the planks, a heartbeat, slow and steady, as though the ship itself had begun to breathe. From within the shadows, the bloated, waterlogged bodies of the dead crew began to twitch. The first to move was Jacob's. His eyes, now clouded and gray, snapped open, and his lips parted to let out a long, hollow breath. He rose slowly, joints creaking unnaturally, his skin hanging loosely from his bones. Behind him, the others began to rise as well, each sailor grotesquely transformed into a twisted version of their former selves, their faces pale and bloated, their eyes void of any humanity. They were no longer men. They were part of the ghost ship's crew now, their souls bound to the vessel for all eternity. Silent and obedient, they moved with eerie precision, taking their positions at the helm, the rigging, and the deck, just as they had in life, but now they served death. The ship itself seemed to respond to their presence. The sails, though torn and ragged, caught a phantom wind. The ropes, slick with seawater and blood, tightened themselves, securing the vessel's masts. The wheel turned, guided by unseen hands, and the Valkyrie began to move, gliding effortlessly through the dark waters. The transformation was complete. The ship, once a vessel of the living, had become a part of the ghost fleet, a fleet that sailed the cursed seas, collecting souls for eternity. Its new crew, dead and damned, would sail the oceans forever, never aging, never resting, always hunting for the next unfortunate ship to cross their path. As the Valkyrie disappeared into the fog, the ghost ship that had claimed its crew vanished completely, leaving no trace of its existence. The sea, now calm and silent, held its secrets well. No one would ever know the fate of the sailors who had been lost that night, no one, except the next ship that happened to cross their cursed path. And so, the legend of the ghost ship would grow, whispered among sailors in dark taverns and lonely ports, a story to chill the bones of those who dared the open waters. Some would dismiss it as mere superstition, a tale told to frighten the gullible. But others, those who had heard the bells toll in the dead of night, or seen a ship looming out of the fog, knew the truth. The ghost ship was real, and it was still out there, waiting,